Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our OLTA webinar of RON and RIN and what you need to know. We are so glad that you have joined us today. Our presenter today is Scott Gillen. He's the Senior Vice President and Division Manager of the National Agents at Stewart Title. So we are so thankful that Scott is joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Scott.
Thanks, April. Hi, everyone. I know we're limited today because we're all going through a little bit of heartburn. I'm actually down in Houston, and I know Oklahoma is dealing with the storms as well. So right now I have power. I'm going to preface that by saying right now I have power. I think we should be fine for this presentation. I do have real internet and lights and the whole nine yards. So I'm hoping that we won't have any interruptions. So just to maybe give you my background a little bit. So as April mentioned, my name is Scott Gillen. I've been with Stewart Title about 15 years, and my role at Stewart has morphed a bit over the years. I originally supported Stewart's lender outreach, lender sales. I'm a lender by background. About 3 or 4 years ago, I guess it was the end of 2017-ish, I started getting re-engaged on looking at the digital front. Stewart has been involved in the digital closing world, really dating back to 2005. So we were early leaders in the space. So when it started to rear its head again in 2017, 2018, I kind of took the initiative to try to figure out what it was going to look like this time. My role today at Stewart is I'm the district manager over our national agents. So I manage about 60 or so agents who are national in scope, in most cases multi-state agents. So I kind of live on two sides of the fence. I have a very strong lender background, but I've also worked a lot with our agents, and really trying to focus a lot on the digital front over the last couple of years and provide awareness and education on what's out there. So what we're going to talk about today is primarily remote online notarization. I'm going to touch on RIN as well. But really what I want everybody to leave here with is a strong understanding of what the processes are, what some best practices are, what platforms can be used, a little bit about the laws and the legal side to it that we've seen, the technology behind it, and hopefully you'll leave here with a better understanding of remote online notarization. So just frame, okay, so remote online notarization. What I have gotten kind of into the habit of doing on these presentations is really trying to explain what it is and what it isn't, because there is definitely some confusion out there, especially since, over the last 12 months in the COVID world. We've seen a big uptick in trying to find ways to close where we don't have the face-to-face element. Certainly remote online notarization is a means to accomplish that, and we've seen a big increase as a result of it. So what is remote online notarization? At its very face value, it is a 100% digital closing. Documents, rather than having a printed document and a face-to-face environment, documents are presented in a web portal, and consumers are viewing the documents. The notary is explaining documents through a web portal. So it's truly a digital experience. There is no face-to-face element where I can pass paper back and forth. From a legal perspective, the notary laws historically have defined the notarization requirements as personal appearance or in person, face-to-face. In the case of remote online notarization, face-to-face is the concept of face-to-face or personal appearance is replaced with video, meaning we're using sight and sound technology to share the documents and communicate with the consumer. The documents are reviewed online, and ultimately they're signed electronically by the consumer, and they're notarized electronically by the notary. One of the primary functions of a notary is to verify the identity of the consumer. Typically, that's done in a kind of stare and compare scenario where we're showing somebody an ID. In the case of remote online, we're doing notary identification with an electronic process. So we use third-party databases to validate the authenticity of an ID, and we used credit and other data for the consumer to be able to answer a set of questions. We call them KBAs. The consumer has to answer specific questions around who they are and identify themselves in what we call knowledge-based authentication questions, or some people call them out-of-wallet questions. They're questions that typically only the consumer can answer because they're based on very specific things that might have happened in the consumer's life relative to purchasing a home, purchasing a car, what streets did they live on, things like that. So what it isn't. So remote online is not a solution for every transaction, and I think many of our agents and lenders have realized that over the course of the last 12 months. It is a fully digital solution. So the documents have to be digitized. They have to be what we call tagged for signature or readied for electronic execution, and the signers have to access technology to be able to sign the documents. Not every lender is able to provide their documents electronically. Not every lender has the ability to tag documents. As a matter of fact, we'll cover this in a little bit. Very few lenders in the scheme of things have really grasped onto this and have really moved in that direction. Now, it's changed a lot in the last 12 months, but most of the transaction volumes we see today are not tied to lenders. So it's not a solution for lender documents unless you've got lender approval. The lenders have got to have gone through an approval process to be able to complete an electronically closed loan. Ultimately, most lenders don't make a loan to keep on their own books. They sell it to an investor, so they have to have investor approval. They have to have investors that will buy an electronically closed loan package, and there is a process that a lender has to go through to get there. I've been saying this for a couple of years. It's not a Skype closing. There's no such thing as a Skype closing as it relates to remote online notarization. And quite frankly, even with RIN, it's not something that we as underwriters approve. These are done with very well-designed, well-engineered platforms that we as the underwriters, Stewart Title as well as the other underwriters, approve the platform that a remote online closing has to happen in. So, when we first started talking about this a couple of years ago, and then certainly last April when COVID hit, we had a lot of people coming to us and saying, "Hey, can I just record this on my phone?" No, you can't. It's not. That's we have technology approvals that we go through to make sure that the platforms that are used meet certain technological requirements so that we can feel comfortable underwriting it. It's also not a solution for all escrow officers, and each state sets their own rules for what a notary has to do to become an e-notary. So just because you're a notary in a certain state and you're commissioned in a certain state doesn't mean you're an e-notary. And there's a process that has to happen. And there's one in Oklahoma that a notary has to go through. A lot has come up since last May in this concept of what we call remote ink sign notarization. I don't believe Oklahoma issued an executive order around it, but what a remote ink sign notarization, how it was created, number one, is if everyone recalls last March, approximately March 15th or so, much of the country was shut down. Much of the country was locked down. Many businesses were being defined at that point as essential or non-essential businesses. So real estate closings in many parts of the country basically came to a grinding halt. Obviously, we were in an area or a scenario where people were buying houses, they were moving, they were refinancing, and the industry spoke up and said, "Hey, we can't just stop everything in its tracks. What are our options?" So when the governors around the states started issuing executive orders for things like school closures or mask wearing or whatever the executive orders are when COVID hit, one of the items that was added was executive orders around notarization. And what was born out of that is this concept of remote ink sign notarization. It's not a digital closing. It is a paper process where documents are sent to the consumer in advance. They are delivered by runner, overnight mail, whatever the case may be. And then a video technology is leveraged or used, such as what we're doing right now on Zoom or GoToMeeting or WebEx, Microsoft Teams, variety of technologies out there for the consumer and the notary or the closing attorney, whatever the case may be, to visually see each other throughout the closing process. So that consumer has the documents. They've been delivered to them. The notary and or the attorney, the closing agent, will explain the documents. They will verify the ID by the consumer holding it up to the camera and just visually seeing the ID. And then the escrow person will view that consumer actually physically signing the wet documents. That's why we call it remote ink sign. After that is done, the consumer returns the documents to the title company, and then those documents are notarized after the fact. All documents are wet signed. There's no electronic element to this. Documents are returned to the closing agent, as I said, and notarized later, and then document copies are then returned to consumer. The challenge with remote ink signed is that it's really not a permanent solution. It was never intended to be. It was issued as an executive order, as intended to be a short-term solution to solve for what was causing a problem with face-to-face meetings during the COVID initial period. Now, we're sitting here today on February 18th, so we're 11 months into having these executive orders in place. And based on the latest announcements from the Biden administration, we certainly expect these to continue probably for another 90 to 180 days until we get, obviously, the vaccine out and face-to-face returns to some semblance of normalcy. So when I talk about RIN, I say it's not a permanent solution. We've approved it temporarily, but we've limited it. Most lenders will not accept a remote ink signed notarization. There is concern about loss of control of the collateral. In a typical closing, I manage the closing package. If I'm the escrow officer, I have it in my hands the whole time. I'm with the consumer the whole time. There's no opportunity for the consumer to alter documents. I don't ever lose control of that collateral. And lenders have a lot of discomfort with the idea that there's not somebody managing the closing process. So it's certainly not a permanent solution. There has been some states that have tried to move to codify it in this legislative session. I don't expect that to happen. The GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, have been very clear that it is a temporary solution. They've approved it temporarily, and they continue to extend that approval in line with the administration, what the FHFA has done as part of their COVID relief packages, but I don't expect it to stand the test of time. We do not approve it for all transactions. As a matter of fact, we cap RIN closings at $1 million. RON, on the other hand, we cap at $5 million. So it is a process that's out there via means of executive order, but we're, the underwriting community in general, as well as the capital markets in the form of the Fannie and Freddie do not anticipate that this will stand the test of time. So RON versus RIN by state. There are 29 states that have passed RON laws. We're expected to see 12 to 14 more in 2021 legislative sessions. I've read bills now in multiple states, including some states that you'd be surprised would ever pass it. They were adamantly opposed to it years before. So if you look at this map that I show on the screen, everything in green has a RON legislation. We've got a bill. There's a law in place in that state allowing a notary commissioned in that state to become an electronic notary. That includes Oklahoma, obviously, as well as perform an electronic notarization. The states in purple and those that have green and blue slashes are those where executive orders are in place and or executive orders are in place and there's a RON provision. So again, you'll see that we're starting to see the expansion. As I said, 29 states have passed RON. And we're going to continue to see more. The bills I'm referring to and what we've seen recently, which are the surprising states, is we've seen states like Massachusetts, an attorney state. We've seen North Carolina, an attorney state. We've seen Georgia, an attorney state. Alabama. All of these states that are largely driven by attorneys and who are adamantly opposed to this process are now beginning to look at it and approve it. And we expect them to do that this year. So this is a little cleaner map. These are just the ones that have passed remote online notarization as of the end of the year. It gives you a better idea of those states that have it out there. And as I said, what you'll note is the vast majority of the states that haven't passed it are those in gray, and they kind of run the Southeast and up into New England for the most part. And again, those are largely agency states and attorney states. And we certainly expect to see some movement there during this year. So Oklahoma specifically was the 20th state to approve remote online notarization. It was introduced back in February 2019 as Senate Bill 915, executed by Governor Stitt in May of 2019 and effective January 1st, 2020. At the time, it enabled more than 83,000 notaries in Oklahoma were able to become any notary. Now, the reason why I point that out is it's important to note here that when a state passes the law for electronic notarization or remote online, what they're really doing is empowering a notary that is commissioned in their state to be able to do an electronic notarization. That doesn't mean that and it also allows for a property in that state to be closed via electronic notarization. And in most cases, depending on the way the bills are written, it instructs the county recorders that they have to accept those documents for recording in order to perfect the lien. So Oklahoma obviously has been active now for a little over a year. I don't have any good count on how many e-notaries there are in Oklahoma, but I certainly believe that it is beginning to take hold there. And it's beginning to take hold in many respects because of what we've dealt with over the course of the last, basically 9 months or so. What are the requirements for an Oklahoma notary? Again, you have to already have an existing commission. There is an application process. You have to apply to be a remote online notary. You're not automatically be given a remote online notary e-certification. You have to apply for it, pay a fee. There is no education or training specific in Oklahoma, I don't think. But once you apply for it, you're able to become an electronic notary. You do have to select a platform, and I'm going to go into the platforms here because it's very important to kind of to understand the platforms, what's out there, and what you'll use them and how you'll use them. I will tell you that, and I haven't seen the Oklahoma application, but I've seen a lot of the other states. Typically, it tells you to select a platform. I will tell you right now that you're going to select a platform, but you're going to end up in the end using more than one because you want to pick a platform that's something that you can control your transactions with on transactions that you drive. But at the end of the day, the lenders have their selections too. So you may choose one platform and end up having to use 3 different ones as well. So just go into that with open eyes. You need to understand that there are multiple platforms out there. Stewart has approved, I believe, 7 or 8 now, and I'll show you those in a few minutes. But there are platforms that we go through the approval process on. So one of the things that was interesting that happened as a result of COVID is, I mentioned earlier, 29 states have passed remote online notarization legislation. If I go back to 2019, the end of 2019, Fannie's guidance largely was in lockstep with the states that had passed legislation. So they had 29 states that they would allow a lender to close a loan via remote online notarization, and Fannie would buy it. As a result of the COVID situation in March, Fannie went back and looked very closely at all of the laws across the country. And I say Fannie, I'm collectively saying Fannie and Freddie because they all report up to the Federal Housing Finance Agency, or FHFA. So they went back and they really looked at what their guidance was. And towards the end of March, I want to say it was March 23rd, they issued a lender letter. It's listed here as Fannie Mae Lender Letter 2020-03. And what that lender letter did is it instructed lenders that it was expanding their approval of remote online notarization, or more importantly, remote notarization in general, because the RIN executive orders had begun to rear their head. And they expanded it basically to 45 states plus the District of Columbia. So this list of states here are states where a lender can close a loan via remote notarization, and Fannie will buy it. And that was certainly an impediment to the process. But when Fannie and Freddie's expansion of this allowed for lenders to look at the closing process and really start, and title companies as well for that matter, really start to look at how am I going to solve for closing transactions in this COVID scenario that's going on. And that's why really since March of last year, we've seen an intense increase in the number of transactions, as well as the number of lenders and title companies that have gotten on board using remote notarization as a tool. And I want to emphasize the fact that it is a tool. It's not something that every consumer is going to want to do. It's an optional closing process. Right now, we've got a typical face-to-face closing. We've got mail-away closings. We use mobile notaries. Now we've added to it the concept of remote online notarization and the ability to do that in the state of Oklahoma as well as other states. The states that aren't approved, interestingly, California. California has fought the legislation around remote online notarization. They actually have a task force working right now. I anticipate they will pass a law in 2021, but they have not approved it. Fannie Mae will not buy a loan in California. And then Maine, Mississippi, Rhode Island, West Virginia are also loans that have not, or states that have not been approved to close a loan via remote online notarization and sell it to Fannie or Freddie. The other thing that's important to note is one of the things that that Fannie and Freddie did is they reiterated the need to record the transaction. So when I talk about the portals that we're going to go through here in a minute, these portals actually create a recording of the actual signing act and the notary process. So we require as the underwriter that transaction be recorded via video. And Fannie and Freddie reiterated it where they instructed their lenders that sell loans to them that they expected those lenders to have access to the recordings of the transactions in the event that there was a challenge to the closing at some point in the future. So they reiterated that originally with a life of loan requirement and then revised it to 7 years. All right, so one of the questions that I get all the time, especially from agents, is I've been ready, but nobody else is doing this. Why am I ready to do it and I can't find any lenders ready? I'm offering it, I'm marketing it to my local lenders, but they're not able to do anything, so I can't use it as a tool. As I said earlier, there is an approval process that a lender has to go through to close a loan electronically. So, a remote online notarization, as I said, is a 100% digital process. It has to be electronic in its very nature. It has all documents signed electronically. It has the notes signed electronically. It has a security instrument signed electronically and typically recorded electronically. And lenders have an approval process they have to go through. Part of that approval process is not only getting Fannie and Freddie to approve them selling loans to them in that manner, but also requires that they get their warehouse lender, the banks that they use to lend money from, whoever's servicing their loans has to approve of it, and the investors they sell the loans to have to approve of that process. Well, what we've seen since last March is an enormous increase in the number of lenders that have gotten on board. So as I said, the questions I get all the time is, I'm ready, but none of my lenders are. How do I know which lenders are going to do this? So there's a website, and I've got the link here. Everybody's heard of MERS, Mortgage Electronic Registration System. It's historically been used to track the sale of loans from servicer to servicer. But MERS put together what they call the eNote registry back in 2005. Stewart actually registered the first couple of loans on the first couple of notes, I should say, eNotes, on the eNote registry back in 2005. So we've been engaged with it for quite some time. The problem is from 2005 until 2018, there was very little movement. Only about 330,000 eNotes were created. So you think about that over that 13, 14-year period, we didn't see a lot of movement with eNotes. They were slowly taking hold, but lenders had to get their approval. If you go to the link mersinc.org/eregistry, it'll give you a list of all the originators, warehouse lenders, etc., that have approved the digital process and the eNote process. The list to the right is something I just pulled this morning. There's actually 92 lenders across the country, small in the scheme of things from a lender count perspective, but 92 lenders that have gone through this approval process. There's 65 in queue as of about 10 days ago. So we'll quickly get to 150 lenders that are approved to do this, and we're slowly starting to see this expanding. Now, when I mentioned March of last year, the count in March of last year was 43. 43 lenders had gotten approval. So we've more than doubled in the last 9 months, and that continues to grow. Quicken by far is the largest. Quicken is doing an enormous amount of eNote volume, but we're starting to see more and more lenders get on board. I mentioned a minute ago that there was 330,000 eNotes on the eNote registry in 2018. There were 18,000 eNotes added in 2018. So since January 1 of 2019 until today, we've gone from 340,000 eNotes to 1,002,036. So since that time, we've added more than 700,000 e-notes, close to 700,000 e-notes to the e-note registry. That tells us this is now taking off. We are starting to see the lenders get involved, starting to see it pick up. About 6% of loans in 2020 were closed on e-notes. As of the end of 2020, approximately 2% of the e-notes delivered to the GSEs, a little less than 2%, were closed as remote online notarized closings. So again, not a huge number in the scheme of things, but I do think that in 2021, we'll easily see that number of e-notes climb up into double digits, 10, 15%, and it will continue to see it grow. This is a different view of that screen I just gave you, and I actually pilfered this from some friends at MERS, just to kind of give you a different snapshot of this. So the originators are in those first two columns: warehouse lenders, servicing agents, and investors. If you look at the investors, I think that's what's telling. In 2005, 2006, when this started, it was Fannie and Freddie, the only ones that would buy an e-note. Now you see Wells Fargo, you see JP Morgan Chase on that list. You see Plaza Home Mortgage, you see PennyMac, you see Mr. Cooper, you see large lenders that are now willing to buy an e-note. And that's been key. And I think that if you look to the bottom of that far right column, the other recent ad that is huge for us is Ginnie Mae. So all FHA, VA, USDA type production ends up in a Ginnie Mae pool. Well, when we only had Fannie and Freddie, that was about 60% of the market that you could close as an e-note and sell that loan. Now we've got all the FHA, VA, the government lending that is now qualified to be sold into a Ginnie Mae pool. Ginnie actually issued their first security in January 2021 of e-notes. So now we've got arguably 90% of the production out there is covered by a willing investor to be able to buy an e-note. And that's really why we're starting to see these huge additions to the number of lenders getting involved and starting to close this way. I just saw a quote yesterday from Quicken, who was very heavily on this Ginnie Mae securitization, indicating that they expect their numbers to increase markedly now that they can add their government production to it. So an idea of volumes, this is just the last 12 months. As I mentioned, there's a 1,002,036 e-notes as of Jan 31. 56,000 were done in January of 2021. But you kind of see the ramp here on this. This is the number of e-notes that are being delivered each month. And if you go back and you look at this graph, you see 2019, 2020, and the beginning of 2021 there. You can kind of see how this is ramped all throughout 2020. Little dip in November and December, more seasonality, cyclicality that we typically see in the market. But again, you saw a monster month in January of 2021. So the growth is there, and it's happening with the lenders. So just as I mentioned, just to kind of give you a little background on Stuart's experience with this, we've done probably about, I would say that number is closer to 7,000 RON closings across our agents and our direct offices since we started this in July of 2017. We did our first RON close in July of 2017. A lot of people think they're millennial closings. This was actually for a couple, husband and wife, 58, 59 years old. It was a refi. They knew the process of closing on a real estate transaction. It was a convenience play for them. They lived in Chicago. They didn't want to get in their car at 4:30 in the afternoon and sit in traffic. This was offered to them. They closed the transaction, and we've been off to the races ever since. Now, this is an important thing to note. As I said, lenders have been slow to adopt. So while we've been doing this since 2017, 93% of the transactions have been cash and seller side. And that's important for you all because cash and seller side are transactions you can control. There's no lender involved. There's no lender documents. So in 2019, about 6.5% of our transactions involved a lender. So again, that was because we had a limited number of lenders that could do a fully digital closing. In 2020, that percentage went to 15. So almost 3 times more of our transactions involved a lender because we started to see that uptick of lenders beginning to do digital closings. A lot of that was a COVID effect. We'll continue to see more and more increases. The RON volume has increased 547% from 2009 to 2019, 2020. And from an e-notary count perspective, Florida, Texas, and Virginia have the most notaries that have been e-certified in their states. Those happen to be early adopters. Texas passed their law in 2017, went into effect 2018. Virginia passed in 2012. Most of the vendors that support these closings have their notaries in those 3 states. But as these laws have come on the books, we're seeing more and more e-notaries get certified in their own states and are able to manage those closings. Okay, platforms. Again, as I mentioned, most underwriters, actually I think all underwriters at this juncture, have gone through the exercise of vetting and approving platforms. So there's a lot of startups out there. I think at last count, I think I heard on an Alta call, there were roughly 35 different startup kind of RON or digital closing platforms. They're not all alike. I would caution you when you go to pick a platform to pick, to look closely at who you underwrite with and figure out what they've approved. Stewart's approved these 8. Notarized Notary Cam were the first 2. The unique thing about Notarized Notary Cam is they have their own network of notaries. So they have professionally trained e-notaries that can support the closing for you. So I'll say the signing for you. The platforms also allow you as an escrow person to participate in that closing, help explain documents. The notary just performs the notarization. Pavaso is another one that started as a digital platform and added RON. Nexus, which is owned by Amrock, connected to Quicken. They've got an approved platform, and by affiliation, SnapDocs is a big vendor out there that does mobile notary work. They leverage the Nexus platform, so we've approved SnapDocs as well. Signix is another platform out there that we approved last year, as well as eNotaryLog and Black Knight's Expedite platform, which uses a technology that we had previously approved called DocVerify. And then the last one is a title production system. So Qualia, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Qualia. It's a title production platform. They added a RON capability within their platform. Stewart recently approved that as well. So we're starting to see this migration into the title space and into the title production system platforms, so that an escrow officer can stay resident in their existing title production system if they're on Qualia in this case, and perform that remote online service. It's important that you look at the platforms and think about the platforms in a way on what works best for you. So what I mean by that is, as I said, you only can control the transactions that don't involve a lender, right? So you've got cash, you've got seller side warranty deed signings that need to happen. So when you start thinking about the platform, look at all the platforms. I can assure you, you will use more than one, but look at something that you can operationalize internally. Look for things like integrations with your title production systems. If you have to tag documents, how easy is it to do? Or will that platform assist in tagging? Notarized Notary Cam, for example, SnapDocs, they have some tools that will help tag your documents so that you don't have to place the signature lines and the date blocks on the documents itself. They can help you. Look at that and see how easy that is if you want to try to do that yourself. Look at lender coverage. And I'll use a good example. Notarize has probably the best lender coverage. They've got several large lenders like United Wholesale and Bay Equity and Thrive Mortgage. There's Guaranteed Rates, another, that use the Notarize platform and mandate to a title agent that if they want to use a RON, they have to use that platform. So understanding the lender coverage is important, because if you're going to pick a platform, you might look at one that has good lender coverage, but equally as important, you need to recognize that even if you don't want to use that for your internal purposes, you're likely going to use it if you're doing business with any of the lenders that require that you use it. So that's an important thing to understand. Ability to perform both in-person and electronic notarizations and RON. Look at a platform that if you want to do an in-person closing, but you want to have electronic signatures, documents tagged to minimize missed signatures or misdates, anything like that, look for a platform that can do both. There's certainly, most of these platforms can do that, but you want to have something that you can leverage for both. If you use mobile notaries, look for platforms that mobile notaries are familiar with. Extremely important, as I mentioned, looking at leveraging multiple platforms. If you're going to try to operationalize this yourself, you're going to put yourself in a position where you can only close transactions during the business hours that you want to close them. Working with somebody like a Notary Cam or a Notarize that has their own panel allows you to leverage their panel outside of your business hours. So if you have a consumer who is traveling overseas, you have a consumer that's in Hawaii, you have a consumer that wants to close at 10 o'clock at night because they work shift work, using one of the platforms that has a notary capability or has their own notaries on staff, that consumer can schedule the closing around their convenience. So you can take that signing experience, that timeline, and expand it and say, consumer, when would you like to close? If you want to close at 9 o'clock at night, that's okay with us. We'll schedule it with an electronic notary. So I would encourage you to look at those platforms as well, because they do give you that capability. Eligible transactions. There's a lot of different transaction types, obviously, that we deal with day in and day out. And as I said, what you control as the title, as the escrow officer, as the title person, is cash transactions and seller side transactions primarily. Those are the ones that you can dictate, or you can make recommendations on how you want to sign those. And you can offer using remote online as an option to consumers with those transactions, because you don't have the noise of a set of lender docs. All you have to do is worry about the documents that you need to create and make sure those are tagged and can be signed. And that's how you're going to get lift internally in your operations, is start with those transactions that you can control. So cash and seller, as I said, at this juncture, at least in the Stewart world, are about 85% of the transactions are closed, are seller and cash. Lender transactions are starting to increase, but you have to have lender approval. They've got to have digital documents, digital notes, and typically that's happening at the corporate level. You could go down and call on a branch, ask if they're familiar with it, if they have the capability. More importantly, look at that MERS website and figure out which lenders have the approval to do so. And those are the lenders you'd want to target with this process. Important to note, the property has to be located in a state that has a remote online law in place. So, or has a remote notarization law in place, meaning that some states may not. So today, what a lot of the notary vendors use is they'll use a notary in another state to support a closing in their state. And what I mean by that is you may not have certification to be able to do your closing or to become an e-notary yourself, but that doesn't mean that you can't find a notary using Notary Cam's platform who happens to be in Texas who has that certification. But the property itself has to be located in an approved state. So I can't go close a loan in a state like West Virginia today because they don't have a RON law on the books. Fannie won't buy a loan in West Virginia, so I've got no way to do it. I can buy a property in Oklahoma because Oklahoma has a RON law on the books, and I can close the loan in that manner because that law exists. So you have to understand what the laws are in your state and what you're able to do. Consumer eligibility. We at Stewart, and this is Stewart's rules, will allow both residential and commercial loans to be closed this way using RON. We do cap RON closings at $5 million without senior underwriter approval. We currently have approved states where this says all 50 states. We know that some states like Massachusetts and Georgia at this juncture will not record an electronically closed loan or electronically notarized loan. So there are states that fall out of this. But basically what Stewart does is says, hey, issuing agent, it's your responsibility to verify that you can get these documents recorded in those states. So again, I'd point back to that slide I showed with all the states that Fannie will buy loans in. In most cases, those states you can close via RON. Obviously in Oklahoma, you've got that capability there because of the law being passed. Consumer eligibility, it really should be a U.S. citizen. And the reason why is, as I mentioned, we have the knowledge-based authentication questions that the consumer has to answer. For those KBAs to work, the consumer has to have a U.S. credit profile. So it's very difficult to do a RON closing with a foreign national because they don't have a U.S. credit profile, so they can't pass those KBA questions. So we encourage this to be leveraged for U.S. citizens and U.S. citizens that have an established credit history as well as government-issued IDs. Operational considerations. So I kind of carved this up specific to the different state laws that exist. So in most states, you've got a RON, in the states that have a RON law passed and the Secretary of State has set the rules, then a local notary can go ahead and perform that RON closing. That is the case in what you have in Oklahoma. For example, if Georgia passes a law tomorrow and it doesn't go into effect until 2022, then more than likely I will allow a loan in Georgia to close that way, but I won't allow a Georgia notary to do it because the law won't go into place until January of 2022 for a Georgia notary. So I would say to a lender in Georgia, if that law passed this year, that they have to use a notary from another state. Keep in mind that the notary is commissioned in a state and is governed by the laws in which they're commissioned. So if a RON law is passed and I decide I want to close a loan in that manner in a state that doesn't have rules set for the notary, then I can go to a Texas or a Florida or a state that has a RON law and leverage one of the notaries in their state to perform the notarization process. And that's, again, where that group of vendors that has their own notary panel comes in handy. If a RON law has not passed, a RON notarization must be performed using a vendor notary. So what I mean by that is if you don't have a commissioned a rule for a commissioned notary to perform the closing, you have to use an out-of-state notary. And again, I mentioned Texas, Florida, Virginia. All of our vendors out there that have panels have their notaries in those states that have laws passed. So it's important to understand where you're at and what you can do. In the state of Oklahoma, obviously, if you've got your e-certification, you can perform the notarization yourself. If you don't, you can leverage a notary in a state that has passed that law using the panel of notaries that the vendors have. We talked a little bit about RIN. Executive order approves RON or RIN in some states, but it is temporary in nature. So just know that going in, if you're trying to close along using that kind of closing process in a state outside of Oklahoma, for example, you need to make sure that you understand what that executive order is and when it expires.
Hey, Scott, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
We did have a question come in a little bit ago about RIN. Do you think there will be any approved RIN closings in the next 3 years?
I will tell you that I know states have attempted to codify it. I think what we will see is a hybrid of the process. In other words, what I mean by that is RIN as it exists today, where the video is used just to see the consumer's ID and to watch them sign and send the documents back later. We as underwriters don't like it, nor does Fannie Mae. I don't see that passing. What I think might happen is what Alta has called, they call it a PRON, or a paper remote online notarization. And the idea behind that is it's not really online, so to speak, in the case of Iran, but what I think will happen is you'll see legislation be introduced where paper is still sent to the consumer, but the consumer has to go through a portal to have their ID validated. The KBAs and the ID validation will happen just like it would in Iran, so that we have an electronic means of validating the authenticity of that ID and the identity of that consumer. And there will be a recording of the transaction. So Alta calls that PRON. I do think we will see that rear its head, where there is a paper-based version of a remote notarization, but that does include the safeguards of identifying that consumer. That's what I would anticipate will happen.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Hopefully that answered the question. Best practices, if you're going to move forward in this, make a decision based on what transactions you can control. I mentioned that earlier, cash, seller. The lenders will come. Don't make your decision based on the lenders. Certainly make yourself aware of lenders in your market that might be doing this and what platforms they use. But you've got to run your operation. You run your title operation, and you've got to run it in such a way that you choose a platform that you're comfortable with. Look at the process holistically. So what we've talked about today is closing. But what's your whole digital strategy? What are you doing pre-close? Are you using DocuSign? Are you using other digital tools in advance of the actual closing? That helps get your escrow staff accustomed to the digital process. As I said, pick a vendor that meets your needs, but also contract with a vendor that has a notary panel as a backup. If you've got folks that are certified and they're out of the office, if you've got somebody who wants to close in off hours, choosing a vendor like Notary Cam or Notarize gives you that backup, gives you the flexibility to be able to take the closing to the consumer, just like you do today with a mobile notary. Look carefully at your certification process. Make sure your folks go through that application and certification process. Scripting, extremely important. Remember, you are creating a recording of this session. So when it's all said and done and you do a closing, there is a permanent record of everything that was said during that closing. Think about that. Create a script for your escrow staff. Use the vendors that have trained e-notaries to learn from, and create a script and make sure that you guide the consumer through the process. And you have very specific scripting around it. And ask them questions like, you're aware that your electronic signature is legal and binding. Can you clearly hear me, or can you clearly see the documents you're signing? Do you understand the documents that you're signing, and have you had a chance to review them in advance? Think about questions that you want to have captured that can be used in defense in the future if they need to. So scripting is extremely important. Know your market. Can you e-record? What are the lenders in your market? Are they approving of the process? Training, and I don't just mean internal. You got to train your staff, but you darn well better be out there talking to realtors, talking to your referral partners, and make sure they understand that this is an option that you have to offer, because you don't want to throw something out there and say the consumer doesn't have to come in, they can close from the house, and that realtor was expecting that face-to-face kumbaya moment at closing. You want to make sure your referral partners understand it as well. And then lastly, technical support. Remember, you are closing this electronically in a digital portal. If that consumer has a problem with their camera, they have a problem with their microphone, your escrow officer, if they're performing the closing, is the one who's going to be your technical support person. So think about that. Make sure you have some kind of access to technical support. And again, consider leveraging the vendors, because they have that kind of technical support, and you can leverage them until you've got the support in place yourself. Last couple of slides are just some resources that I want to go through. So not everybody's underwritten by Stewart. I understand that, but we have something that we call virtual underwriter that is not limited to just a Stewart underwritten agent. Any agent can access virtual underwriter. We have RON resources and coronavirus resource pages on virtual underwriter. It includes all of our bulletins, state by state, what you can do in every state related to RON, related to RIN. It has forms out there for, forms like video authorization, things like that, e-disclosure samples, something that if Texas, for example, has a paper out process where you can take an electronic document and have it recorded in a non-e-record county. There's paper out affidavits you'll find there. So there's all kinds of resources. Also has a list of the RON approved vendors that Stewart has approved. Doesn't matter who you underwrite with, make sure you know what platforms they've approved. So virtual underwriter, you can Google it. There's no password protection to it. Anybody can get into it. I mentioned coronavirus resources again. Another page on there gives you some guidance around the RIN statutes and other things out there, both national bulletins and state bulletins. We put that resource out there for everyone to use. Hopefully we will get away from having to have a coronavirus resource page soon, but it is out there as a tool for you today. Some of you might have heard about the Secure Notarization Act. Last March, we attempted with ALTA and the support of the Mortgage Bankers Association, the American Bankers Association, the Consumer Bankers, to get an authorization in the CARES Act that would authorize every state to have a RON provision so that we could close transactions under the COVID scare. It didn't pass. It didn't get included in the CARES Act, but it has been reintroduced. It has been reintroduced with the same support and actually has picked up a lot more sponsors. Obviously, trying to do this in April and May of last year when everybody was scrambling to survive through the early stages of COVID. It didn't get included in that CARES Act, but we anticipate that it will rear its head again. So if you're asked to support the Secure Act, it's really just leveling the playing field and giving us 50-state access to this closing option that is remote online notarization. And lastly, I am going to talk a little bit about Notary Cam. I mentioned a lot of the platforms. I will tell you that Stewart Well, first of all, you have to be platform agnostic. Stewart acquired Notary Cam. We are happy to share with you and provide a demo of the Notary Cam platform for you. But again, lenders will choose platforms. So you need to be somewhat agnostic. You need to pick a platform that works for you. Notary Cam is a great platform. Uh, all of them have their benefits. Notary Cam's been around for a very long time, and we are working on operationalizing it within the Stewart operations, as well as offering it out to our agents. Um, they've been at it for quite some time. We did one of our first closings, I think, in September of 2017 on the Notary Cam platform. We've done quite a few on it. So if you want to see a platform, feel free to reach out to me. I can set up a demo, allow you to show the platform. As I mentioned, only a few of the platforms have their own network of e-notaries, certified e-notaries. Notary Cam happens to be one, Notarize is another. I believe eNotary Log has some notaries on their panel. It's important that you select a platform that has that as well, even if you use a different platform for your internal use. So happy to share that with you and do a demo if that makes sense. I believe April's going to share my contact information when we're done here, as well as the deck. So April, I'm going to see if there's any other questions.
Okay, did anybody else have any other questions for Scott? All right. Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. This was extremely informative. I personally learned a lot. So I really appreciate you doing that in the midst of a blizzard outside. If anybody has any further questions, I will be sending out an email with Scott's contact information. And don't forget to fill out the affidavit and email it to me so you guys can get your CE credits. And thanks again for joining us. Have a great day.